Order, order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Wednesday, the 25th of February 2026. We're here to start our inquiry about the future of the Office for Budget Responsibility. It's 15 years since it was created by then Chancellor George Osborne, and since then it's had two chairs, and we're delighted to welcome Sir Robert Chote, who was the first chair of the Office for Budget Responsibility and did that job for 10 years. And welcome back to this committee, because it's a while since you've been here. I think none of the members of the committee, Sir Robert, were here when you were last coming regularly. But we're pleased to welcome back as well Richard Hughes, who was a regular visitor to this committee, and he stood down from the OBR's chair role at the end of last year. Before we go into the main session, I did think, Richard Hughes, it might be a good opportunity for you to speak. This is the first time we've been in front of a Lords committee, but the first time you've been in front of the House of Commons since your resignation. I wondered if you wanted to say anything about that.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I should start also by saying that I'm now a senior economic advisor at Tower Capital. And thank you once again for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be before the committee again. As this is my first appearance before the committee since I stood down as chair, I'd just like to start by reiterating my apology to this committee for the inadvertent early disclosure of the OBR's EFO on the morning of the 26th of November and the disruption that caused to the business of this House. It was a technical but serious error for which I took full personal responsibility. I hope you'll agree with me that the OBR's actions since then, including commissioning two independent investigations, one led by its non-executive directors and one led by the National Cybersecurity Centre, publishing the full results of both in a timely manner and implementing their recommendations, reflects the organisation's commitment to recognising its mistakes, transparently investigating them and taking the action necessary to fix them. And I have full confidence that the changes the OBR is introducing around the publication of the next EFO on the 3rd of March will ensure that such an error will not recur.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I think your resignation speaks volumes about taking responsibility for something that obviously did go badly wrong. I should stress as well that we have heard evidence from the Treasury and the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury at a recent meeting that the papers from the OBR, this spring statement next week, will be published via the Treasury because the OBR has not yet got in place its new arrangements. So, but they're still independent, but they're published through the offices of the Treasury without any interference. So it's just to make that clear. Now, I wanted to start, if I could, I think I'll go to you first, Sir Robert, if I may, about, in broad terms, you've both had this big job, but 15 years on, are there any changes that you think should be brought in to the Office for Budget Responsibility? So, Robert, from your perspective, 5 years out, what's your take on that?
Sure. I think the rationale for creating the OBR is as robust now as it was back in the day when it was being considered. There were various options that were considered before this final model was come up with about providing rigorous, professionally based analysis of the public finances to inform both policymakers' decisions and the public remains a robust one. I think it's important to be clear about the task that the OBR was given by Parliament originally, and that was clearly two key components of it were to produce forecasts looking ahead 5 years and to use those for the evaluation of the government's progress against its fiscal rules. So, as I'm sure we will get onto, there's a debate about whether there is too much focus on estimates of how close the government is achieving to those fiscal rules, but that was literally the job that Parliament gave the institution at the outset. The other thing I think to bear in mind, and it comes interestingly into the questions I know you want to raise around forecast performance, is again, Parliament has specifically tasked the OBR with producing forecasts, not unconditional ones of what you think the most likely outcome for the economy and the public finances is, but what you think that outlook is based on current government policy. So if, for example, you look at the performance of forecasts for government borrowing over a 5-year period, you see that the OBR underpredicts government borrowing. That is a feature and not a bug. It's a reflection of the fact that governments have chosen to increase the spending plans that were originally in place when those forecasts were made. So I think in terms of thinking about the OBR's role, it has, I think, in good faith and pretty professionally done the task that Parliament has set it. I think there has then been an interesting set of issues over time as to the way in which governments have dealt with the task of putting together a fiscal framework, developing policy, and essentially deciding how responsive policy ought to be to what are inevitable moves up and down in forecasts. So I think that there's obviously a good deal of work ever to be done at the OBR about looking at your forecast performance, looking at the analytical work you do, ensuring that you can do that in the best possible way. And the OBR, I think, produces the single most detailed and comprehensive evaluation of its own forecast, although I see, interestingly, the Bank of England has just popped up with a new one in January of this year, so maybe they're joined there. But in terms of the way in which the broader framework has been operating, the issues of how ministers, how the government uses the forecast, how it talks about and how it sets policy in the face of an outlook that inevitably moves is something that is well worth this committee looking at.
Okay, well, that's a good. We've got, obviously, we'll have some detailed questions about some of the points that you raised. But so you basically are saying you think it's still the right thing to have, and it's broadly doing a good job.
Yes, I think so. And of the various models that others have thought about, for example, doing as some other countries do, having the fiscal watchdog not producing the forecasts itself, but scrutinising and judging the reasonableness of forecasts that come out of the government. That's a perfectly feasible thing to do. But I think it's important to bear in mind that there are particular practical and process difficulties which would arise with that. And in particular, the evidence from other countries is that the access to information that the body needs to reach those sorts of judgments could be much more contested and much more difficult, much more frictional in terms of the relationship between the institutions and ministers than the model we have at the moment, where like the Netherlands equivalent, the OBR is the monopoly producer of the official forecast and has a private interaction with the government as the forecast is being developed and the policy package in parallel.
Okay, thank you for that. So, Richard Hughes, the same to you.
Yes, I'd agree with all of what Robert said, and reiterate the point that I think that the legal institutional architecture on which the OBR rests, I think, is very strong and very sound. I think both Robert and I, during our time, lent on it from time to time when we needed to, in order to deliver the mandate of the OBR, especially around access to information, especially around the right to produce that information. I do think it's important that the organisation continues to adapt to the changing landscape for fiscal policy making. And I think during my time, a lot of that was just reacting to changes in the outside environment. I arrived in the middle of the pandemic. We then had the energy crisis. We then had the mini budget. And so just kind of understanding what all those events were doing to the economy and the public finances was important, and was not so much about changing the institutional arrangements for the OBR, but making sure that it was flexible in basically, understanding novel shocks, talking to different kinds of experts to understand what pandemics do to the economy, understand what energy shocks do to the economy, and making sure that it is an outward-facing organisation that has access to expertise around the UK's very rich economics community and wider community of experts, including in the areas of public health and energy markets and those sorts of areas. So I think the OBR has to stay sort of flexible and adaptable to a rapidly changing environment in which fiscal policy is made. I think during my time, a fair amount of work that we did in terms of trying to progress the institutional architecture for the OBR was around kind of addressing kind of gaps and lacunae in that institutional framework. One of which was that the OBR produces this report around fiscal risks and sustainability. It's a very important report. It gets a lot of attention in this committee. It gets discussed in the Lords Economic Affairs Committee. It doesn't get very much attention from government in terms of a policy response in some sort of formalised way. EFOs do because they're accompanied by a budget. The FRS is basically an EFO for the next 50 years, and it tends to highlight some much more fundamental questions about the trajectory of the public finances. It doesn't get anything like the kind of response that the EFO gets. It started out with a sort of over 100-page response from government. It now gets a sort of cursory, 10 to 20 pages in a written statement. There's no parliamentary debate about it. So I think the lack of focus on risks and sustainability, which in many ways are much more important to determining the long-term trajectory of the public finances, is an area which does need more attention within the framework. The second area where this committee has been very, very much involved is trying to improve the way the OBR forecasts departmental spending, so departmental expenditure limits. We had an investigation and a report to this committee during my tenure about whether there was adequate exchange of information between the Treasury and the OBR about risks to departmental spending, about whether the government's spending plans are fully explained and fully justified. And more recently, in the last few years, the OBR has had an explicit kind of legal right to basically not believe the government's departmental spending plans and put in something which it thinks is a more realistic reflection of the cost of government policy in areas like health, education, transport, asylum, and other areas. And I think that's that is very important to having a credible forecast, because our own exploration of the OBR's forecasting record demonstrated that one of the biggest misses in terms of forecast accuracy was around departmental spending consistently ending up higher than what the government said its plans were, oftentimes for reasons that were pretty well understood and people were well aware of. And then thirdly, in the last few years, the OBR has taken a more transparent approach to the scoring of the supply side effect of policy measures, and that's an area which the organisation has kept under review. You will have seen alongside the November EFO, the OBR published a paper sort of drawing some lessons from the kind of initial outing of that new, more transparent approach to so-called dynamic scoring. And I think that's an area which the organisation needs to keep under review because it's relatively novel. Not that many countries do it. The US does it. The Dutch do it. It does create different kinds of incentives for policymakers, and it's very important those are borne in mind.
Okay, because I think we'll move on to who's wagging the dog and that end of it. Just before I pass to Mr. Murphy, so Robert, when you were there was the EFO had grown quite a lot. Useful information was kept. And then Mr. Hughes, when you arrived at the OBR, I think you stripped some of that out. Could you just explain why you made the decision to make those changes from your predecessor at the time? So, Mr. Hughes.
I think there was a constant struggle about how long the EFO should be, and it tended to kind of balloon, and then people would complain. We'd do a survey of our readership, and they would say, on the one hand, we'd like it to be shorter, but on the other hand, we'd like to see all these extra things, which you don't currently provide. And I think over time, I suspect my average EFO was about as long as Robert's average one, although it kind of grew and shrank over time. On one occasion after the mini budget, we had to produce it so quickly, it only ended up being 60 pages, and some people loved that and some people hated it. But I think one of the things which we've tried to do is have the EFO be a comprehensive summary. It's a command paper to Parliament. It's important that it's a comprehensive and transparent summary of the public finances, but complement that with working papers, briefing papers, lots and lots of disclosure on our website, ready reckoners people can use, so that we're also providing people with the tools to develop their own understanding of the public finances and not just have it sort of delivered by us in kind of words and verbiage. But
for the record, Sir Robert was nodding in agreement to that.
Yeah.
I think briefly you want to add, Sir Robert, before I...
Yeah, sure. I think my sense, obviously, was you were always conscious that there were different audiences with different interests and expertise who were consuming the report. So, I always had in my sense, there was as a former journalist, there's the people who basically want the 1 page to 4 page summary. There's the people who want the 20 pages. One of the reasons why the report grew is that there are a whole lot of areas of the public finances in which people have a very legitimate interest in one small part of it. For example, how the student loan system works or what the trends are in welfare spending. And so there's always the temptation of saying that, you need at one hand to have products that provide something to a journalist who's not an expert on any of these areas, but needs to get a grip of it quickly, but also to provide that level of valuable information that people are not getting from anywhere else around key areas of the public finances. The other thing I also had in the back of my mind is that the Treasury needed to know that there was no part of the public finances so boring and incomprehensible that if they tried to do anything dodgy in it, that the OBR wouldn't devote 3 pages to doing a box to explain what was going on.
Okay, well, on that note, Luke Murphy, MP.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to pick up on Sir Robert's point a little moment ago around the comparison with how it's done elsewhere. And you meant around in terms of who does the analysis. And you said that we should be, I think, suggesting we should be wary of that because of the friction it creates and the relational problems. But I guess the question I just want to follow with, but what about the actual policy outcomes? Because that is about the process that occurs as a result of that different relationship. What is your view on the actual policy outcomes that kind of different relationship delivers in other countries?
Well, I think just maybe it's in terms of the background for the other countries of who does what. There are roughly, I think, 55 fiscal councils in the International Monetary Fund updates a regular database, and I think at the end of the last calendar year there were 55. Of those, 18 were preparing forecasts like the OBR. in only 2 of those cases, and the OBR not being one of them, is that forecast actually binding. So it's perfectly feasible for a chancellor to say, I don't agree with this forecast, or I think things are going to turn out differently, and to explain why that's the case and to present an alternative view. You have, I think, 44 out of the 55 monitor fiscal rules. So having to reach a judgment about, is the government on course to achieve what it says it's going to do, and how far away from that it is. But interestingly, of the 55, 42 of them actually make policy recommendations. So they say what the government should do, not just this is some background analysis which informs Parliament, which informs the government. And the OBR is not one of those. So we are in the relatively small majority that is actually relatively distant from the policy decision process. You're not telling people, not telling the government, well, our forecasts show that the public finances are not consistent with the rules. We think you ought to change the policy. It's I think very rightly for elected ministers to decide in that scenario, do you change the rules, do you change the policy, or do you say, I'm willing to live with this apparent discontinuity? So to the extent that this does affect the way in which policy outcomes come, this is because ministers choose to let it be the case. There is nothing that the OBR, there is, I think, one fiscal council of the 55 that can actually stall the budget process. So these are not like independent central banks with policy making scope. And as I say, the OBR isn't even making recommendations. So I'm very wary of language around the sort of the OBR has forced us to do this or forced us to do that. That's not the case. It's the combination of the targets that the government sets itself and its decisions on how to respond to forecasts that show them on or off course.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Grady, Mr. John Grady, MP. Okay, I think it's been answered. In which case, Yuan Yang, MP.
Thank you, Chair. So Roberts, you mentioned that there was a comparison you made between the friction introduced by models like the Netherlands model and models such as other countries where the equivalent of the OBR only scrutinises and checks the Treasury forecast. That comparison is really interesting because the Netherlands has about 3 or 4 times the amount of staff to do those forecasts than the OBR here in the UK, and certainly comparable departments at the IMF or the World Bank or the Bank of England would have vastly more macroeconomists involved. Do you feel like you risk becoming, falling into the gap between 2 scenarios? You've been asked to do a really big task with much less of the resource. And that leads to some of the volatility and unpredictability of the forecast process itself.
I don't think it leads to volatility in the forecast process. It's certainly true the case that the OBR has fewer macroeconomists to play with than for example, the Bank of England. I remember Charlie Bean's first appearance before this committee, and he was asked about whether the OBR had a sufficiently large staff to produce its macro forecast. And he said, well, of course, I had many people to do this at the Bank of England, but you can produce a perfectly good macro forecast with 12 people. Little did he realise that we actually only had 6. But I think it's nonetheless the case. I think that the sorts of judgments that you're making, and it is unusual because the OBR needs to produce a different sort of macro forecast from the most of the ones that are produced outside, much more focused on nominal variables, i.e. cash amounts, because that's what's driving tax receipts, etc. And I don't think in that sense the OBR is particularly understaffed in that respect. Clearly, like anybody in the chair would always like more resources to be able to do more and different interesting things. But I'm not sure that doubling the size of the OBR's macro staff would make a great deal of difference to the performance or the volatility of the forecasts that are produced.
Yeah.
In the comparison with the Netherlands and the size of the institution, and the key difference there is that when the OBR is producing what is a very detailed bottom-up forecast of revenue and spending and financial transactions, all of which then meshes into what you say about budget balances and about debt, etc., it is drawing on what I think we counted up in my day was the equivalent of 125 people, full-time equivalent, in places like HMRC, DWP, etc., to feed in the material. At the end of the day, the OBR always made the judgments, always it was deciding what was put out, but you were relying on the kindness of not strangers, of the kindness of friends to pull that together, whereas the larger fiscal councils, of which the Netherlands, the US and the Koreans would be the big ones, are just doing much more work in-house. And so the fact that you have this sort of the model of relying on the experts in the tax field and in welfare, for example, is an artifact of the way in which the OBR was created and originally sort of taking some functions out of the Treasury. So I don't think the size affects the volatility.
Thank you, Ms. Yang.
Sure, but in those cases, you're still relying on, say, HMRC experts and also DWP experts and so on to input into your forecasting. So there is still that shared task, if you like.
Exactly. Yeah. And as I say, at the end of the day, the OBR owns the forecast. And if the OBR takes a view of what is explaining trends in a particular part of the disability budget, then the OBR has that view, and the department is perfectly entitled to, if they are asked, say that it takes a different view. But I think it's a very good system, and that if you're looking at, what you can learn from the latest output data on North Sea oil production or on capital gains tax, then making use of that expertise and the people who are involved in the maintenance of the tax system as well as the design of it is a strength of the system and not a weakness of it.
And a question to either Sir Robert or Mr. Hughes, looking back over the 15 years since the creation of the OBR, one of the initial intentions was to produce more accurate and more credible forecasts independently than they would otherwise be produced under a Treasury. Has that happened?
We're going to Mr. Hughes first.
Yeah, so when I first arrived at the OBR, one thing to say is just to reiterate Robert's point that from day one, 15 years ago, the OBR produced, I think, still what is one of the best in the world forecast evaluation reports, which transparently reports how its forecasts have performed from year to year, both economic and fiscal, and is one which has been copied by lots of other fiscal councils around the world and now emulated by the bank. When I arrived, one of the things I commissioned was a sort of backward look, looking at the OBR's forecasting records since 2010, and basically, how do we compare to the Treasury? How do we compare internationally? How do we compare to other domestic forecasters? And what we found was that, looking from 2010, this was up until 2023 when we did the report, but we now keep it up to date in all successive forecast evaluation reports, was that our forecasting record compares pretty favourably to other forecasters in the UK and other official forecasters around the world. We're beaten only by Belgium in our year-ahead forecasting accuracy for GDP amongst European official forecasters. And we were both more accurate and less biased than Treasury forecasts in the first 3 years of our forecast horizon. Our forecasts were...
That affects reduce over the longer period. So you're better in the first 3 years, but then you're similar to the Treasury over a longer period.
Better in the first 3 years. We were more wide of the mark in years 4 and 5 for reasons which drove kind of further work on our forecasting infrastructure during the rest of my tenure. I mean, the reasons were reasonably well understood by the time we got to the end of the process, and to some extent reasonably well understood at the time. On our economic forecast, it was because we were overestimating productivity. There's been a consistent downward adjustment to our productivity forecast. Also, the OBR has just been around during much bigger shocks to the economy than during the Treasury's forecasting record. So you had the financial crisis, COVID, and the energy crisis are just a succession of very large shocks to the economy and public finances. And if you don't adjust for those, it looks like your forecasting record is worse. But in fact, you've just had a tougher time trying to forecast the future. And then on the fiscal side, you had the obvious consequences of if you overestimate productivity, you're going to overestimate revenues, and that's going to mean you have a larger deficit because revenues are higher. But then it also revealed the structural problem with departmental spending, which is that, especially in years 4 and 5 of the forecast, after a spending review period has come to the end, governments tend to be far too over-optimistic about their public spending plans, which always get revised up when it comes time to do a spending review and do an allocation. And that's what's informed the discussions that we've had about strengthening the OBR's role in forecasting departmental spending.
So over the first 3 years of a forecast, you'd be more accurate than the Treasury was previously, but over the year 4, year 5 at the end of the forecast period, you would be less accurate than the Treasury was previously. And some of that is structural, as you said, and not and about the changing era that you're in.
Yeah, I'd expect that to improve. Now that the OBR has a more central forecast for productivity, what we thought was a more central forecast for productivity, as well as it can take its own view on the path of departmental spending. It gives it the option of putting in something which it thinks is a better reflection of the actual cost of government policy.
Yeah. But overall, does that mean that when assessing a 5-year forecast period, in the 15 years of the OBR compared to, say, the previous 15 years of Treasury forecasts, the OBR forecasts have been more inaccurate at the end of that 5-year period compared to the Treasury previously?
I think you have to adjust for the environment in which you're operating, I would say. So you've got, the OBR was just facing much more significant shocks than the Treasury was. I mean, I was in the Treasury in the 2000s, and forecasting the macroeconomy was easy. It was always between 2.5 and 2 3/4 up until 2007. It didn't take very much dexterity to think about what GDP growth was going to be on average over that period, and inflation was low and under control. We then had periods where GDP went down by 25%, and inflation went up to double digits. So I think you have to bear in mind that the life since 2010 has been rather different than life in the 2000s.
But does that sound like then? Sorry, just to ask. Does that sound then like the OBR's creation was to solve a problem that didn't really exist in the 2000s? In that, as you said, those forecasts were so stable and also credible. I
wasn't around. I wasn't in the country at the time of the creation of the OBR. I think its creation was designed to have more transparent forecasts, more credible forecasts. Even when the economy was growing relatively strongly, the Treasury actually did have relatively over-optimistic forecasts for trend growth during that period. It also tended to have over-optimistic forecasts about where the public finances were going to head, and insufficient analysis of the risks to the outlook, which turned out to materialise in spades in 2008. So, part of setting up the OBR was an attempt to get more central and credible forecasts, but also just much more transparency around what were the actual ingredients of putting that forecast together.
Absolutely, thank you.
So Robert,
I think in terms of the problem you were trying to solve when you came in, or when the OBR was created, I think the view then in particular was that when Gordon Brown was Chancellor, you had a succession of over-optimistic forecasts for the budget deficit, and that was because of judgments that went into the fiscal forecast more than what you thought about the macro forecast. Because the macro forecast, in a sense, there's no reason to believe that the OBR is going to be any better or worse than that as anybody else. They are all based essentially on the same publicly available information. The main reason why there was over-optimistic forecasting in the period prior to the financial crisis was essentially judgments that went into the financial sector corporation tax forecast, which, as the IFS, where I was at the time, pointed out, was sort of persistently over-optimistic and hard to justify on the basis of where you thought things were moving in the medium term. So the disease you were trying to cure, I think, was rather more in the sort of less visible, less comparable judgments that went into the fiscal forecast than the view you took of the macro forecast, where, yes, you might say that there was trend growth was penciled in at slightly too high a rate, but that's an issue on which reasonable people can differ. In terms of your point about the 3 to 5 years, I would come back to the fact that just because governments change their mind and push up public spending in years 4 and 5 before you get there, I'm very wary of the idea that the OBR should be put in there. The OBR is there to say what are the consequences for the economy and the public finances of the current government's current policy. And you can certainly point out, particularly when you're talking about risks, that if you look at the past, these numbers in years 4 and 5 always tend to be changed. Those are policy changes. When you're thinking about the public expenditure or DEL expenditure in public services, when you're in the very near term, it does become more of a forecast. Once you get to this stage of the financial year, the outturn for DEL is essentially a forecast and not a policy choice. But in years 4 and 5, it is. So it would have been a problem if the OBR had plugged in those sorts of spending numbers ex ante, because that was not the policy ex ante, and that's not the job that Parliament gave the OBR to do.
Thank you. Last one.
Sure, but so Robert, you mentioned that this under-prediction of borrowing and the overconfidence in departmental spending limits being stuck to is a feature and not a bug, as you said, of the system. But do you not think there is a role for more scenario planning so that the OBR is able to produce credible forecasts of departmental spending, not just the the forecast that the departments give you?
There have been various suggestions around that. For example, what should you assume that Dell spending evolves in line with what would be necessary to maintain a constant quality and quantity of public services? What would you need to do to deliver a particular set of policy priorities? I think doing it in that sort of fashion is an interesting exercise, and probably an exercise that's as well done outside the OBR. For example, the Public Services Tracker sort of material that's produced by the Institute for Government. I think you don't want to go down the world of essentially saying that the job of the OBR is to predict what future governments will do in terms of policy, or to say what future governments should do in terms of policy. I think you can say, confronted with a situation like this, what do we learn from the way in which governments have behaved in the past? And that can provide you with a source of scenario. A classic case on the away from spending would be it is government policy to raise fuel duty in line with inflation. It's never government action to raise fuel duty in line with inflation. So just explaining what that difference is. But I would be very wary of going down the route of the OBR basically saying what spending should be, or this is how governments are going to behave, so that's our central forecast. That you can get, the OBR and others could say things in that space, but I think it would drag the OBR into a very politicized space, rather than saying, at the end of the day, Dell levels are a policy choice that the government can take. They historically change them once they've made an initial judgment, but you carry that and you explain it, rather than trying to get ahead and say, well, we think that in 5 years' time, the Treasury's in-year Dell target is going to be X.
Thank you. Richard Hughes on that.
I'm generally in favour of scenario planning where they're within the OBR's mandate. So I think highlighting sensitivities and trade-offs, I think, is what we've always tried to do in EFOs, and where we think that there's particular uncertainty around a particular item of government spending and revenues, I think it's just always useful to illustrate, and also to illustrate patterns of behaviour. I mean, the classic one has been on fuel duty, where the government always says it's going to index fuel duty. We always have to put that in our central forecast, but after advice from this committee, we've also shown what would happen if that didn't materialise. And I think on departmental spending, I mean, one point to really underscore is that in that year 4 and 5, if you look at the report we did on our forecasting record, in recent years, 100% of the borrowing miss in years 4 and 5 has been departmental spending. All the other changes were basically offsetting in other items of spending and revenue. And so it really was what was explaining a lot of the error in the OBR's forecast. And that is an artifact of what Robert was saying, which is that we are a conditional forecaster. We have to take government policy and put that into our forecasts. Other outside forecasters can say, well, I don't believe this. I don't believe what the government is saying. I'm going to put something else in this forecast because I believe that's what year 5 is actually going to look like. The OBR doesn't have that choice. And so it has to rely on scenarios, sensitivities, patterns of behaviour as a way of saying, look, this is what's in our central forecast, but these are the risks around it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Luke Murphy, MP.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask about measuring the growth impact of supply-side measures. So I think, as you've just alluded to in the previous discussion, I mean, Andy King said the forecasting of the OBR acts as a guard against politically motivated wishful thinking. But I wonder whether you thought we have a new problem of process-driven short-term thinking, where a chancellor is incentivised to do what they believe, rather than being incentivised rather to do what they believe will drive growth. They look instead at what the OBR will assume drive growth. I just wonder what do you think of that?
I think you'd have a bigger problem if the OBR didn't pay any attention to the growth effects of policies, which is the attitude that some forecasters take. Not most, but some forecasters just say, look, we're not going to take account of the economic effect of any government policy. We've got a macro forecast. We're going to layer on top tax and spending decisions, and they just cost or yield what they cost or yield. We're not going to think about the interactions. We're not going to revisit our macroeconomic projections in light of that. That's never been the OBR's approach. I mean, from the very beginning, when Robert set the OBR up, I mean, the OBR has always very transparently accounted for the demand side effect of policies through the use of its fiscal multipliers. And also, the OBR did from time to time make adjustments to the supply side to reflect the impact of policy.
I guess I'm not suggesting that the OBR shouldn't. I'm just reflecting on the period of which you're in charge of the OBR. Do you think that has actually happened? Do you think you have observed that chancellors have been incentivised to do something different that actually isn't good for long-term policy making And this isn't about picking on the OBR or saying it. It's about a relationship and a dynamic that's been created. So it's more like, do you have reflections on the dynamic that's happened, and do you think that is a fair assessment, rather than whether it's a question of whether OBR should be scoring it?
Well, I think I had sort of the opposite experience, which is that when we in 2022 we decided we were going to be more transparent about how we accounted for the supply side effects of policies. Partly because governments were talking a lot about growth effects of policies and they wanted to understand the implications of them. Partly because the OBR just believes in being more transparent about the way in which it comes to judgments, and partly because we just did feel as though the OBR has an obligation to policymakers to be predictable about how it treats things, because chancellors don't like being surprised when they suddenly discover that we just think differently about a particular employment policy or a particular tax measure. And so we did set out a framework which said, look, we're going to be more transparent about how we think about the effect of tax policy and spending policy on employment, on investment, on productivity. Our experience in the first few forecasts of that was that we were sort of overwhelmed by policy initiatives from the Treasury and the rest of government as a way of trying to sort of get things through this system. And one of the reasons why in the most and to be honest, when we looked at them, the growth effect of most of those policies was very, very small. It was far less than 0.1% of GDP on the level of output.
And in the forecast period, or what about in the longer term?
So 0.1% of GDP by the 5th year of the forecast. So on the level of GDP, that's not on the growth rate, right? On the growth rate, it's not just a tenth of a percentage point. It's something even smaller than that. And so when we look back, in the end, we had taken account of 19 policies that we thought would have some kind of an effect on the supply side, and where, according to the criteria we'd established, there was a reasonable basis for reflecting those in our forecast based on the evidence you could find for their effects, the fact that they looked additional to the forecast that we had. But once you actually thought about the materiality of those, and we ended up putting in a threshold of 0.1 as a way of basically saying, look, we're not interested in being the arbiters of government growth policy. What we want to do is get our forecast right. And if there are some measures which are of sufficient magnitude that might move our forecast, we'll take explicit account of them. If not, we just kind of assume that they're in the baseline outlook for the economy and public finances. Once you put that sort of significance threshold in there, the number of measures which actually mattered, to a significant degree, went from 19 down to 6. And so the vast majority of the measures that came through were very, very small kind of labour market measures, a few measures on the tax and welfare side, which were making a few thousand people difference into a workforce of 30 million, and so in that sense, I think disproportionate energy was being put into feeding into an OBR kind of process, which could actually be better devoted to trying to improve the growth outlook of the country, which would show up in the data and in our forecast when it materialised. It was really for us as macro forecasters dealing at the macroeconomic level, trying to make sure that when you saw very big changes, like the big increase in public investment that you saw, like planning reform, like the freezing of thresholds or the increase in employer NICs, that those kind of measures, which do have material impacts in the near term and in the medium term on labour supply decisions, on business investment decisions, did get captured and reflected in our forecast, because otherwise it kind of would have been wrong. Many of those other things, were too small for us to even know whether they worked in outturn, because you wouldn't really know whether you could observe them in the data or not.
Wonder if Sir Robert had anything to add on?
Well, the only thing I would add is there's inevitably an asymmetry here. So certainly in my period, and I suspect this may have been even more the case under Richard's periods, you had during the course of each forecast process things called the indirect effects meeting, which is when the Treasury would bring a series of papers saying, one of the measures that we're considering in this budget is X, and we think that this is going to have the following beneficial effects to the economy. I don't think in my 10 years a paper ever came saying a past policy which we implemented is not working out quite as we anticipated, or actually we've done something which has negative effects here as well. So there's an asymmetry built into this that I think the more in which you take on what in the end, as Richard says, can be relatively small changes to an underlying number for, say, productivity growth, around which there is an enormous amount of uncertainty anyway, and just seeing the things that the government, hopes will push it in one direction, and they chuck as much at the wall and hope that it will stick. Whereas if you were being fully transparent about it and fully symmetric about it, you'd be wanting to go into a lot of detail around how things that have previously been announced, has this planning reform actually delivered? Has this change in welfare reform actually affected labour supply in the way that was originally anticipated, and that could result in an enormous amount of work that is going to actually end up not moving the dial on your inevitably uncertain forecast for productivity growth that much.
And can I just ask a follow-up on the way in which you assess the impact of public investment? So there's been criticism by bodies like IPPR, I should declare that I used to work for IPPR, that you don't capture second-round dynamic impacts, certainly in the way in which their modelling does, in the public capital crowds in private investment. How do you respond to those criticisms? Do you think they're fair? And do you think you have the appropriate resources and capacity to do accurate enough forecasting?
Yeah, so when we scored the impact of public investment, the increase in public investment in the 2024 budget, we assumed that £1 of public investment catalyses 30p of private investment. That was drawn basically from the literature, both in the UK and in other jurisdictions, and was a central estimate based on people who have actually done empirical studies of these kind of things. But because there is uncertainty about these numbers, and you never quite know whether the present looks like the past, where these studies inevitably draw their data from, we also looked at alternative scenarios. One where every pound of public investment catalysed £2 of private investment, as well as one where public investment was a substitute for private investment. So every pound of public investment meant 50p less private investment, because there are sectors where government investment is just a substitute for private investment. You know, if the government builds a house, that might be one less house that private builders need to build in order to accommodate people living in the country. So part of the challenge we have as forecasters is that government just announces one big number for public investment. At the time, it didn't say where it was going to spend it. So you have to kind of assume a blended average of all public investment, and some of that will be good for growth, some of it will be good for delivering public services, but be fairly indifferent to growth. So we did think it was important to do scenarios around it. We ended up, as a central estimate, having sort of 30p for every pound. I mean, I have to say, if you look at what's happened to public investment in the UK over the last 10 years, it's grown from 1.5 to 2.8% of GDP, sort of nearly doubled as a share of GDP, public investment. Business investment was flat during much of that period. So I don't see a lot of evidence in the actual data for a catalytic effect from public investment driving several multiples of what it's investing in the private sector. But maybe that will be different in future, and that's why we did alternative scenarios. We thought 30p for every pound was a reasonable central estimate.
Robert, I think it might just be worth adding that I think in a lot of these areas in which policies are aimed at driving supply side change, they actually just do take quite a long time to deliver that, and the amount that will show up in a 5-year forecast is relatively limited. And part of the reason for that is that even if you do things which are changing the flow of investment in the public sector, in the public capital stock, or the flow of labour into or out of the country, what in some senses matters to the underlying productivity position is the stocks of these things. And so you might not be making that big a difference even with a relatively successful policy on flows to your stock of public sector capital, your stock of housing, the size of the working population. So in a way, you would expect some of these things to come in relatively slowly. And obviously, I think any minister or any chancellor with confidence is going to say, well, this is the right thing to do. The fact that not much of this is showing up over a 5-year period is no reason not to proceed with that. I would certainly hope that would be the approach they would take.
Just one final question, going back to where we kind of started. So would you agree, I mean, basically this is me surmising what you were saying earlier on, do you think governments are too focused on these tiny policies that they think might move your assessment, rather than the rather bigger, substantial policies that will really move the dial on growth? Is that your kind of assessment?
I mean, I don't want to criticise. I mean, governments should do whatever they can to get growth going, because it's definitely a problem for the country. I think in terms of where it focuses its energy, we tried to make sure that in the design of the system, we made sure that from the point of view of a forecaster, we were really only focusing on things that were material, but also that we were looking not just 5 years ahead, but longer term. So wherever we had a policy which we thought would have a bigger impact after 10 years or after 30 years than you could see in the 5-year forecast, we always provided that additional projection for be it public investment, be it planning reform or other kinds of areas. So. But I do think that, I mean, as Robert said, if you want to affect the growth trajectory of this country, you've got to move some very big stocks. and that's 30 million people in the workforce. That's 200% of GDP in the capital stock. Typically, what government policy operates on is flows, and so just adding a few tens of thousands of workers back into the workforce from a welfare to work scheme, or just investing an extra 1% of GDP or 0.5% of GDP in public investment, to see the effect of that, you need to be patient, and you either need to do something very big in order to affect that stock, or you need to do something small but be patient and wait while that flow makes some kind of meaningful difference to a large stock of workers and a large stock of capital in order to make a meaningful difference to the growth potential of the economy. We tried to give government the best sense of what we thought from a forecaster's point of view was material in the near term, but also what could have an effect if you looked beyond and you were patient enough to get to the long term.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murphy. Chris Coughlin, MP.
Thanks, Chair. So Robert, if I just come back to you on a couple of points. I completely agree with you about the issue that a lot of policy effects on growth take longer than 5 years to materialise, but I don't share your optimism in terms of the political ease to do that if they're not showing up in a official forecast. So, for example, Draghi has just called the EU to borrow to invest in defence R&D, arguing that will actually lower debt to GDP ratios over the long run because growth will rise faster than the debt. How do you solve this 5-year issue in terms of, do you think it'd be a lot easier for the government to adopt long-term economic policies if the OBR was putting out both a 5-year and a 10-year forecast where a lot of these effects could materialise?
So Robert.
Well, I think in terms of looking at some of the impacts of, as you say, for example, a relatively substantive change in the share of GDP that's spent in capital stock, then the OBR is already producing relatively stylised 50-year projections in which I think you can make a relatively informed view on that. And the 5-year horizon, if you were to move to 10 years, you would obviously get some more effects of policies that you need to be patient about showing up. And the US, the Congressional Budget Office, does projections over a 10-year period. There was a period in which a Chancellor under my watch did think about and warned us that we might need to be ready to move to 10-year forecast, but then in the end decided not to do that. One of the challenges with moving to a 10-year forecast is that it requires, as the OBR would then have to require the government to be quite explicit about its policy around a whole range of payments and tax thresholds and up ratings over that 10-year period. And my sense was that one of the things that got in the way was the reluctance of a government to wish to be able to set out all of those details over the 10 years to provide you with the underlying basis of a forecast that might then have a greater impact from a particular growth measure. So I think in terms of sort of major changes and substantive, persistent changes in, say, the amount you're going to invest in public sector net investment, then what you can learn from the 50-year projections is probably the best bit of information to get for, and underlines the importance of the committee and others focusing on those projections and not just the 5-year forecast.
Mr. Coughlin.
And then just come back to you on your point around forecast being completely fine, being sort of small team, resources are okay, top-down forecast. To be clear, I was on previous Treasury Committee sessions with the OBR. I was fairly staggered, to be honest. The basis, as I understood it, for the productivity forecast over the last 14 years or so has essentially been that at some point productivity will return to the pre-2008 level, or a haircut of that, of 2%. And it seemed pretty finger in the air to me, to be frank, for a G7 economy. And if you look at the last budget, so much of the political debate around that was driven by the 16 billion productivity downgrade, which was, again, fairly finger in the air on the basis of that. So I really struggle to understand why having more resources, doing bottom-up forecasts when there's stacks of economic research over decades about how productivity is generated, would not be a better way of doing it.
So Robert first, and we'll go to Richard Hughes.
Yeah, I have to say that in terms of producing a medium-term productivity, so productivity forecast, we're not talking here about the investment, we're not talking here about flow of labour supply. There is a limited amount of science, to be frank, that you can bring to these sorts of things. The challenge that we had, certainly most of the period that I was in the role, is that we'd had a financial crisis prior to which you just got used to essentially productivity or the economy growing by 2% a year, and it had done for decades, to a dramatically weaker performance. And you don't mischaracterize the decisions that we had to go through a lot of that, which is essentially how much weight do we place on the relatively recent weak period versus evidence that over a much longer period, these numbers have come out relatively strongly. And you're right, I think I must have presided over 4 reductions in the underlying productivity forecast during my time. And most of them were based on, now we're getting more evidence that this is not something that's directly related to the financial crisis. It looks like it's something that's consistent with global developments. It looks like, that it's not financial sector or crisis specific, and you were making adjustments on that basis. And that, I'm afraid, is the territory for that sort of area. Now, one of the things you're obviously looking at is how your forecasts compare to others, and obviously more recently the OBR was in a position where they moved the forecast more consistent with those taking a different view, and that's reasonable.
Mr. Hughes, do you think I'm being harsh or unfair describing the OBR's productivity forecast as finger in the air?
So I think I would say,
Mr.
Hughes.
Yes.
Sorry, that's the wrong.
Yes, I think you are being unfair.
Okay.
But I think the uncertainties around those forecasts confront any forecaster that's producing a productivity forecast, and particularly one over 5 years.
And of course, Mr. Hughes wasn't here when the other members of the current members of the Committee for Budget Responsibility, David Mills, described what happened. But Mr. Hughes, from your perspective,
so productivity assumptions, I think, they always tend to be the least well understood and modelled aspect of any macroeconomic forecasters, because. And one thing that was a positive development during my tenure was something which actually happened at the ONS, which is when we put together the supply side of our forecast, you've got a stock of labour, you've got a stock of capital, and then you've got total factor productivity, which is the efficiency with which you combine those two things. It's only recently that the ONS has actually produced an estimate for the stock of capital, and what that allowed you to do is then isolate that third residual term, which is total factor productivity, which in everybody's forecast involves a certain amount of kind of future gazing and just trying to think about, well, how innovative is the future going to be compared to the recent past. It's a residual in kind of all the growth accounting equations after you've accounted for growth in labour supply and the stock of capital that builds up over time from investment. And it is very susceptible to shocks. And during Robert's time, the big question was, is TFP ever going to recover from the shock of the financial crisis? During my tenure, it was, we've been hit by the pandemic and then by the energy crisis. We knew both of those things were going to be bad things for TFP, but at some point it might recover, and we ended up splitting the difference between the past and the future. In the most recent downgrade, the conclusion we came to was that it did look as though the impairment to TFP in the UK economy was not due primarily to the effect of that kind of series of unfortunate events, but more due to some underlying structural shifts that had been happening, both closing off the UK economy more to trading with Europe and more recently with the US, due to tariffs being introduced by the US administration, and also demographic changes which look to be drawing more and more employment and labour supply away from higher productivity employment into lower productivity employment, and as a result kind of changing the composition of the workforce over time. And so it was for those two reasons that we made a decision to further downgrade our TFP assumption. It now brings us back into line with the bank and some other forecasters, but it's something which everybody keeps under review because it's the least well understood aspect of what drives growth these days.
Yeah, final question. It seems to me very restrictive for policymakers that so much political debate is around a single point forecast 5 years out with these sort of crazy tiny variations driving so many things. How would either of you reform the OBR to have less emphasis on a single single number being put out by the OBR?
So Mr. Hughes first.
So I think, fiscal rules in the UK have been around since the late 90s, and the concept of headroom has been around since the late 90s. When Gordon Brown had fiscal rules, there was talk about whether he was on track to meet them or not. The same was true of George Osborne's fiscal rules. I think the big change that happened in recent years and the why we're talking about headroom so much is because there's been so little of it. And the reason why it's driven changes in policy is because very small perturbations in the OBR's 3 to 5 year forecast meant the difference between meeting or missing the fiscal rules, and not kind of big shocks, just small changes in gilt yields, small changes in take-up of welfare benefits. And so the reason why it became a thing which drove policy, I don't think is an artifact of having a rules-based fiscal framework. Every country in Europe has a rules-based fiscal framework. We've had one since 1997. It is entirely an artifact of just leaving yourself a tiny margin against whatever rule you set for yourself. And also Chancellor's unwillingness to see that rule broken. If they were tolerant to a near miss and saying, look, it's a near miss, I'll make it up later, then people wouldn't focus on it so much. But because it's a sort of binary, because ministers treat it as a binary pass-fail, it also raises the political stakes around having that fiscal rule.
Sir Robert?
I think that's true. If you go around saying things that aren't ironclad and non-negotiable, then it's not surprising people look very closely at the degree to which you think you're likely to achieve that. So again, the fact that the OBR produces forecasts and uses them to assess how close the government is to achieving the fiscal objectives it sets out is literally the task that Parliament gave the OBR in producing that. I mean, right from the very start, despite the fact that that was the job that we've been given, we put an enormous amount of effort, which Richard then took on afterwards, of explaining the uncertainty around the central forecast and therefore the uncertainty about the likelihood that, a central estimate of a headroom of 20 actually meant that you could make judgments about the likelihood or the probability that you would hit the target or not. So we used past forecasting errors, scenario analysis, looking at the sensitivity to key parameters to, again, try to take people away from just the idea that, this is how things are going to turn out, and that's the difference between that and the target. But Richard's absolutely right. I mean, the reason that this has come to be a live issue in the sense that the headroom is driving policy decisions is because when the end of the last Conservative government, the headroom was reduced to a considerably lower level than it was through most of all the previous period of which the OBR and the fiscal rules regime had been there. And then Rachel Reeves, when she came in as Chancellor, didn't use the first budget to rebuild that margin. And as a result, you're then in a situation where the forecast doesn't need to move around very much before you hit the borderline of the rules. And that's a recipe for policy volatility.
Thank you very much indeed. John Glenn, MP.
Yes, I think you've both given a very reasonable assessment of the theory of the OBR, how it should work. You've pointed to the medium-term and long-term assessments that you make, and the fact that you are just trying to do what we do in most jurisdictions, which give a dispassionate assessment of whether the government's policy is working. But the reality is that if you look at any investment in education, infrastructure, energy policy, planning reforms, those cycles of delivery are much longer. And in a world where we've got the level of debt that we've got now and the volatility around the cost of debt, and we've got a legacy of the state growing quite significantly with expectations of what the state will do, and we've got demographic pressures as well, the sort of sensitivity of the political cycle, if you like, doesn't mesh well with that calm, dispassionate assessment that you're making. So I suppose I've heard what you've said about the 5 and 10 year horizons, but if you were designing from scratch today, as we are now, with the level of debt we've got now, with the size of the state, with the growth trajectory we've had over the last 15 years, how could we design the OBR differently from the starting point of today so that it would be a more effective, dispassionate arbiter of government policy, rather than as it's become not a commentator on government policy, rather than an absolute arbiter of it, and having the authority that it seems to have. And as we saw in the run-up to the last budget, an extremely tense apparent standoff between briefing, allegedly, between one entity and the other.
Who's that to first?
I mean, I think perhaps Sir Robert first, because this is an offer to say, it's not George Osborne and Rupert Harrison, his chief of staff, who you're talking to, but if you were starting now and you were talking to an opposition now who was trying to say, well, what would we do in the future, or a government now, how would you design it differently?
Sir Robert.
Well, I think implicit in your question is that the issue here is you don't, if you have a situation where the way in which political decision making is taking place interacts with the provision of, as you described it, sort of dispassionate analysis and assessment of what the outlook is, the solution to that is not to get rid of the dispassionate assessment
I'm not saying
and analysis.
get rid of it. I'm just saying, can you refine it so that the interaction is better? Because it's not now, is it?
So Robert, the point is, you were right there at the beginning, designing this, and setting it up. So if you were, we can ask you both, but if you were there, Sir John Glenn, Sir John, Right Honourable John Glenn, I'm sure you deserve it.
I don't mind the slip.
Only a matter of time.
But as John Glenn says, you were there at the beginning. So if you had a free hand now and you were sitting down with a Chancellor and saying, right, this is the Office for Budget Responsibility, how would you design it? Is there anything that we just touched on at the beginning? You said not much change, but there's an open opportunity for a new blueprint.
Yeah, no, but I do think fundamentally that the model that you have of having a professionally based, dispassionate analysis of how the public finances are likely to evolve under current government policy that is fundamentally the role of the OBR. We're not in a commentator or a giver of views as to whether policy is right or not. The aim is to be a technocratic exercise in producing the best analysis you can on the basis of all the available information and what the government tells you about what its policy decisions are.
So Robert, can I just
the framework and the application of the framework is what needs to be changed, not the value of having somebody providing that.
So how would you
can I just say, my total purpose in asking this question is not to dismiss the OBR, something I have deep respect for you, for your successor, and for what the theory of this. What I'm just saying is that it's quite obvious that the way that politics works and the way that the OBR's documents are poured over to look at if there's any discrepancy, the way that those numbers have got to sync up over the short term rather than the long term, militates against any government having the strength to take the long-term decisions that are likely to elevate the level of growth. And I'm just desperately trying to find a way to improve this, because nobody's disputing the theory of the OBR, but it's not working in the way that it was probably envisaged and as it probably did in earlier seasons, because the public finances are so different over the last
because the Chancellor, primarily because the Chancellor had put in a much higher level of room for manoeuvre against the targets they'd set, so that there was less political pressure to change policy when, as is inevitably the case, forecasts move up and down because of new data, new financial market movements, etc. So I think
the average headroom from 2010 to 2024 was, I think, 25 billion. So I totally acknowledge what you said about the last Conservative budget, and that wasn't replenished. But I think we're also seeing a situation where the level of debt post-COVID and the energy crisis and the cost of that debt, it means that the public finances, notwithstanding the fact that the state does more things than it did when we were back a generation ago, creates that problem where there is little room, and public expectation and political cycles require governments to do things. In practice, there's very little room to do much at all because you've so hemmed in by that short cycle. And your answer seems to be, well, have a high level of headroom. But what I'm saying is that the lack of emphasis on that 10-year cycle surely militates against effective interventions and continuity of policy making, which is probably in the national interest.
Sir Robert, I'll take that one and then to Richard Hughes. Sir Robert.
But there could be, with a 10-year horizon, as I say, if government's willing to articulate what current policy looks like over that horizon, you could certainly, as in the US case, you can have a richer discussion. And as you say, it just raises not about what will be done in the course of the current parliament, but what does this look like as a medium-term programme, etc. But the fact that we still have the budget deficit at the level we do, and I think in terms of the sort of the reaction of financial markets, the underlying concern that we're in a dynamic now that people probably suspect this across the political spectrum, that when there is bad economic news or bad news for the fiscal position, the goalposts get moved, and when there's good news, it's spent. Right. And that results in an upward ratchet in the level of the debt to GDP ratio, and probably greater concerns that you're hitting ill-defined inflection points where the market is going to take a dimmer view. So I think if you want to have an environment which is more conducive to being able to take and to stick to long-term decisions, persuading people, as I say, that you're not just going to spend any good fortune that comes down the way and ignore any weaknesses is probably a good place to start.
Thank you, Sir Robert.
Throwing back to the politicians, Richard Hughes.
Richard, I think if you want to get policy focused on the long term, you have to look to the long term. And the OBR produces a document that allows precisely that kind of discussion and debate. It's the Risk and Sustainability Report. It doesn't just look 10 years ahead.
It's not the one we have, though, is it? I recognise the theory of that.
But we don't have it for several very good reasons, which is we have one hearing at this in this room once a year on it. There's no government policy response. There's no parliamentary debate. It gets nothing like the focus of the EFO. But if what you want to do is show a difference to the growth trajectory of the country or a difference to the fiscal trajectory of the country from different changes, that provides a mechanism to do it. It's the only way to capture things like changes in the state pension age, changes in the productivity of the health service, the impact of demographic changes on the productivity of the economy, on the tax take, the impact of things like falling fuel duty from the fact we've got electrification of vehicles. So if you want to get ahead of those long-term trends, it does provide you with a basis for looking at the impact of those choices and assessing trade-offs. I think it's particularly important at a time early in parliaments when governments are setting fiscal rules to actually think about whether those rules are consistent with sustainable public finances over the longer term. And also, it's a report about not just sustainability but risks, and so it also highlights the risks that might hit the fiscal framework over the course of a parliament or several parliaments. I think it's a really important piece of work. I know it gets lots of attention from this committee. It gets nothing like that attention from government. It gets nothing like that attention from the rest of Parliament. And so I think if you want that perspective in fiscal policy making, you've got to draw much more attention to that perspective in the way in which discussions are
Would
held
you
around it.
welcome a parliamentary debate on it?
Absolutely.
And what about you, Sir Robert? Would you welcome that?
Okay, yes, no, indeed.
Yeah. It's a bit like the whole of government accounts, which is exciting to some small group of people in Parliament, but never debated in the chamber. So.
But
I'm one of those.
If I could just revert back to the question that I asked Sir Robert originally, in terms of the design of the OBR at the point we are now with the public finances and the situation we find ourselves in, as if the OBR had not existed hitherto, is there anything you would suggest, Mr. Hughes, that would be helpful?
I think for me, much of my time at the OBR was basically watching the crystallization of a set of risks and a set of sustainability problems, which had been highlighted in previous risk and sustainability reports and not acted upon, and then observing the consequences for the fiscal situation we find ourselves in. And so I think the more we can do to not just focus on the central forecast over the medium term, but the pressures on the public finances of the long term and the risks around those scenarios, I think you'll get much better fiscal policy making. And I hope if you do get other people from other countries talking about how fiscal policy is made, it's a huge focus of how they do things in the Netherlands when they set fiscal rules, when they produce fiscal reports, to very much focus on these kind of not just the central forecast but the risks around it, because in the end you've got most surprises the governments face tend to be bad ones, especially these days. And so if you don't take account of them, you're always going to end up with this upward drift that Robert talked about, of deficits going up and debts going up, because when as Robert says, when good things happen, governments don't have any problem spending the money. When bad things happen, they really struggle to offset them.
Thank you. I think I've taken enough of your time.
Thank you very much indeed. Yuan Yang MP.
Thank you, Chair. Just to push further on Mr. Glenn's point
We've done it a day.
about the 10-year horizon. So Robert, you mentioned that one of your chancellors did consider asking you to make this change, but the political concern was that they would have to reveal their policy preferences over 10 years. Given that the OBR has a 50-year projection, which just involves keeping constant the current policy direction, can that not just be done in a similar way over 10 years?
Robert.
You could do it on that basis. As you point out, there is essentially a different set of, in the absence of the government saying what its policy is on lots of things over a 50-year period, you have to make stylized assumptions. And one of the key ones around that is the assumption that tax thresholds, for example, are rising in line with earnings over time, so that you don't have essentially an explosive or a shrinking a deeply shrinking path for receipts as a share of GDP built into that. You could make those sorts of assumptions over the second period of the second half of a 10-year period. The US, I think the Congressional Budget Office has something that is relatively more stylized, but their projections are not quite so rooted in the in a bottom-up forecast of things like tax receipts, which require you to reaching judgments around the levels and rates, etc. So I think the danger of doing a 10-year forecast with 5 years of concrete policy and 10 of stylized things, as it ends up being neither one thing nor the other, and therefore not producing a particularly good guide. I think if you did go to 10 years, you would need the government to be explicit about most of the things that it already has to be explicit about over 5 for that to be meaningful and useful, particularly if you're trying to send any messages about credibility in the way the government will behave beyond the next election.
To ask both of you, a quick answer on this, because presumably that then could be dragging, if you go quite political, because that could be used because it cuts across the electoral cycle or cuts over an electoral cycle. There could be attacks on the government of the day for saying something that would happen in 10 years' time on that basis that other parties could then criticise and run against. Would you be worried that that would lead the OBR to be dragged more than it already is into the politics? Sir Robert and then Richard Hughes.
I would agree, but I think it also explains why that
doesn't happen. Well,
that reluctance to do that, to have need to set that out in that degree of specificity.
Richard Hughes on that?
I think it's a matter of degree more than kind, in that if you're in the 4th year of a parliament, you're forecasting mostly after the next general election anyway. So I didn't find it a particular problem during my tenure.
And finally, I appreciate that you both said in response to Mr. Glenn's question about the framework that, as technocrats, you operated within the framework set by government, but neither of you currently run the OBR, neither of you are bound by civil service impartiality.
We tempt you.
You are free to have political opinions before this committee as much as any of our other non-civil service members. Would you have any comment, for example, on the IFS's traffic light system proposals, where they suggest, rather than having specific numbers that come out in the headroom discussion and the pass-fail, that there is a broader assessment about sustainability in a kind of red, amber, green fashion. So it's much more of a narrative format rather than a pass-fail format. I mean, what would you make of that suggestion? And if you dislike that, are there other suggestions that you've seen from other fiscal frameworks that you think would make the whole system more healthy? Mr. Hughes.
So I guess I've been working in fiscal policy in the UK for 25 years, the UK and around the world for 25 years. And I mean, the one thing I'd point out is that the UK is not at all unusual in the fiscal rules that it has. Its fiscal rules are very similar to those you see in almost every other advanced economy. It's got some target for the balance. It's got some target for debt. They're typically expressed over 3 to 5 year horizon. Sometimes there are carve-outs for some types of spending. At the moment, capital spending is carved out of one of the rules. In Europe, there's discussion of carving out defence. What is really unique about the UK's fiscal rules is how frequently we abandon them. The average shelf life of a UK fiscal rule in the last 10 years has been 1.8 years. No single fiscal mandate has been around long enough to actually be measured in outturn. So our biggest single problem in this country is that we don't stick to any of the rules that we set for ourselves. So we shouldn't be surprised that we've got one of the highest deficits in Europe and a rising level of debt, because we are constantly changing our fiscal rules rather than trying to meet them. And so I think my plea in the world of fiscal rules is to set a set of fiscal rules and actually try to deliver them and have them be around long enough to actually be around in the target date that you set for yourself. I guess my experience with looking at more qualitative or colourful assessments of fiscal performance is that, so since 2021 we started publishing in the EFO exactly what you describe, a traffic light assessment of the sustainability and vulnerability of the public finances. It's mostly amber and red, I should say, because our public finances are not in a healthy position. I never saw any journalist, any member of the public, any member of parliament, anyone on this committee ever pay any attention to it, because there's a whole bunch of different numbers. It takes a very long time to explain it.
Yeah.
In the end, the question you ask yourself is, which one of these things is the binding constraint on fiscal policy? And once you figure that out, it's pretty much the number that you focus on, because you know it's what's going to drive the next round of decisions. Even our own fiscal framework has got 3 fiscal rules in it. I'm not sure anybody outside this committee could name all three. There's one for the current balance, there's one for net financial liabilities, and there's a welfare cap. Nobody focuses on the welfare cap. It's important, it relates to sustainability, but it's not the binding constraint, so it doesn't get a lot of attention. And I do think that my worry about having traffic lights and colours and lots of indicators is that it just becomes an excuse for the government to kind of target shop and say, well, we're not meeting that particular rule, but look at this one. It's gone light green while all the other ones have gone, and it turns out that's the one that we're now much more in favour of. And so my fear is that it would be a mechanism to make it more difficult for this committee to hold the government to account and for Parliament to hold the government to account for its actual performance, because it would kind of pick and choose what exactly it wants to be accountable for. And so I think from my perspective, rules that are simple and stuck to are more important than rules that are complicated. You pick and choose, and also more generally, my heart sinks every time there's a discussion about setting a new set of fiscal rules for this country, because it just means that
many times.
It has so many times. Because I'd just like to see some of them met at some point.
Buried.
Robert, anything briefly to add to that?
Not really. I mean, just to say a rich set of data and a rich, set of things to look at to analyse the underlying fiscal position is very desirable. But as Richard says, I think a multi-component traffic light model is simply an opportunity for people to pick the bit of the traffic light that's green and ignore the bit that's red.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Ms Yang. Jim Dixon, MP.
Thank you, Jane. Meg, just a couple of questions about the speculation prior to the November budget. That sort of, I think most observers saw it as a more speculated about budget than many in the past. And indeed, you wrote a letter to Dame Meg just before the budget talking about the unusual volume of speculation around the pre-measures process. Do you have any thoughts about why that unusual level of speculation was abroad, as it were?
I don't, I can't. I can't interrogate the motives of others. I guess what I would say is that, it is not unusual, and I think in some cases desirable for governments to have public discussions and public consultations about its proposed policy measures. You design better policy by having public consultations about policy, and that kind of used to be the norm in the run-up to budgets, but it was done in a very formal way. There were consultation documents published. Industry was consulted on tax measures, for example. That then fed into the development of policy. What seems to have happened more recently is this stuff kind of happens through anonymous briefings or sources allegedly close to government about what policies are under development. And I think just that level of informality is unfair to the people who are potentially affected by the changes. And it also just kind of sort of feeds this general sense that the process is not orderly and transparent. And then more recently, I think there is, and what was particularly notable about the run-up to the November forecast was just how much speculation there was about the OBR's pre-measures forecast. And the reason why I wrote the letter is that I think there had been, I was concerned about the OBR's reputation for professionalism and integrity on kind of several scores. One is that the OBR had somehow been kind of fickle and changeable in the views it was taking about it's the overall economic judgments around productivity, earnings and other things, when in fact we'd made all those judgments at the outset, and we were at pains to make sure that we'd made all the major economic judgments at the outset of the forecast, so the government had a reasonable basis on which to plan, including about the downgraded productivity, but also the higher earnings forecast, which was a substantial offset as well as on inflation. There was also reporting in the media that somehow our forecast had improved at the last minute, and that it offered some relief to the Chancellor after our pre-measures forecast had closed. That was also not remotely true, and I thought it was important to set that out on the record and give the figures for the evolution of the forecast, which was an unusual step, but one we took because of the circumstances at the time. And then finally, there was also a suggestion that we'd somehow colluded with the Treasury in choosing the window for interest rates that we'd chosen for setting the debt interest forecast. That was also not remotely true. That the decision we took about the time window was taken back in the summer, long before we would have known whether it was advantageous or not to the public finances once it was actually utilised. And so I think for all those reasons, to make sure that the OBR's reputation for integrity and fair dealing remained intact, I wrote the letter that I did. I didn't end up sending it on the day because there were other priorities in terms of our communication with this committee around our own mistakes in terms of pre-publication of the EFO. But at the committee's request, I shared that letter in its original form.
I mean, do you think this speculation generally is a symptom of the way in which the pre-measures forecast process works, and are there some lessons you would look for us to learn about the interaction that pre-measures forecast represents, how to do it better so that we don't get some of this speculation, which clearly is damaging?
So I don't think it's helpful, and I think clearly, when people like the CBI said it was having an impact on business confidence, I don't doubt that was the case. I do think the government seems to have learned lessons from the run-up to the forecast that we're expecting next week, which is that I haven't seen very much speculation at all about what is in the OBR's forecast, or indeed around policy measures. So it seems as though lessons have been learned from that exercise, and I think that's very welcome. I mean, I do think in the end, you can either have a very formalised process of disclosing information, and that's how things work in some countries. They actually publish the pre-measures forecast well in advance of the budget, and that provides a framework within which policy is developed and discussed in government and also within Parliament and more collectively. That's not the way we run things in this country. Instead, we publish the pre-measures forecast and the post-measures forecast all on the same day. I think that has great advantages in not dragging out the budget process and the debate, and allowing people to see the complete picture all at once. But other countries do it differently.
So, Robert, obviously there was speculation back in the day when you were chairing the OBR, perhaps not to the same extent as we saw in November. What was your sense of what happened around speculation prior to the budget, and how did you manage it, and do you have any suggestions for how we can make sure it's reduced and managed better?
Well, certainly through my period, there was a lot less than one saw in the run up to the most recent budget. And I mean, I would concur with Richard's view that anonymous kite flying is no substitute for consultation if you're trying to think about whether a particular policy idea is a good idea or not. And the sharing of bits of the forecast in advance, there has always been a desire to, at the margin, roll the pitch. So if the Treasury or the Chancellor thinks that the numbers are going to look very different from those that the markets are expecting, then I think occasionally, I mean, George Osborne has spoken about this publicly, about the methods you can use to try to ensure that those sorts of things don't come as a complete surprise without leaking. But I think the sort of sharing of components of the forecast, particularly in a way that doesn't actually, when the forecast comes out, correspond with the overall picture. The danger is you're not rolling the pitch, you're ploughing a field. So I think the main learning from this is that it really did not work very well in the run up to the last episode. And as Richard said, there doesn't seem to have been a great deal of speculation ahead of this one. So I don't think there's anything that the OBR particularly can do to prevent this. But I think it has been an opportunity for people to recognise that sort of combination of kite flying and rather cack-handed pitch rolling doesn't do anybody any good in the long term. The other thing I think is it also sets up a culture in which if semi-officially or not, and I don't know what was official, what wasn't, who's doing it, etc., stuff is brought into the public domain, other people will think, well, okay, if that sort of information is being shared, why can't I share some as well? So you're setting up, unfortunate internal dynamics and incentives as well. So I think a return to a presumption of a relatively taciturn, quiet run up to these fiscal events, it would be in everybody's interests.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dixon. John Grady, MP.
Yeah, briefly, because I'm forecasting we need to bring this session to a close at some point in the near future. If fiscal lock had been in place under the previous government, you've mentioned COVID, you've mentioned the energy crisis. Would you have carried out any further analysis compared to what you did, Mr. Hughes?
I mean, it
would
have
been triggered in some way.
It would. So, thinking back to. It would certainly have meant that the OBR produced a forecast in the run-up to the so-called mini-budget, or at least in the immediate aftermath, in the sense that once the OBR had become aware of a policy change of that magnitude, tax cuts of more than 1% of GDP, that would have triggered an OBR forecast, which at the time, we would have tried to accompany those policy decisions, or at the very least done briefly after. So the amount of uncertainty that was prevailing in the aftermath of the mini budget, I think, wouldn't have existed to the extent that it did, and wouldn't have persisted to the extent that it did.
Yeah. And do you feel that the fiscal lock has strengthened the OBR's independence? Again, briefly.
I think it's strengthened the independence. I think also just the transparency around the public finances. It's also, again, it's not unusual in other countries to have that kind of provision that big fiscal decisions need to be accompanied by an assessment of their impact on the public finances. So I think it's definitely an improvement to the fiscal framework, and one which plugs what turned out to be a very big source of vulnerability.
And Sir Robert, you're nodding. So briefly, do you agree with what Mr. Hughes has said?
Yeah, I mean, I have strong views on the fiscal lock in a sense, with the OBR being required to produce 2 forecasts a year. And the Treasury and the rest of the government regime required to support that. There's only so you can only run and hide for so long before the forecast process in the end catches up. I mean, the idea of not taking big decisions without thinking through their impact is clearly a desirable one, but there is also the practical issue that the idea that the OBR can decide off its own bat that it's we need to do a forecast and we need to do it now is not uncomplicated, because this is a very interactive process involving a lot of departments who have their own sort of work schedules of the things they need to be doing and managing and administering different bits of the welfare and the tax system as well. So the idea that you can introduce a system in which there's you can simply drive an 8-week forecast process to get underway straight off is not as straightforward as perhaps it might sound to some. But the notion that it is a good idea when big decisions are taken to think carefully about what their consequences are is right.
Okay.
Thank you, Sir Robert.
Mr. Hughes, just thinking through this hearing and reflecting on your time at the OBR. The OBR is meant to be a technocratic, independent organisation that commands the confidence of us politicians and the public, but it has got a very, very hard job, a job I've got sympathy with, and you've got limited headroom and high debt to GDP. So the OBR's decisions or analysis has a political impact as to whether governments can spend more or less on both sides. Forecasting is inherently uncertain in its nature, and economics ultimately is not a science. It's it's informed by politics or not an exact science, and vast amounts of it are contested and carry significant amounts of uncertainty. As the non-economist on the committee, I feel quite entitled to say that. So really the idea that the OBR can somehow, achieve perfection here is for the birds. And ultimately, would you say that actually it's on this side of the table that we need to start thinking about how we discuss the public finances and discuss the policy choices, where the issue lies, and not so much with the architecture of the OBR. So, as an example, talking about the long-term trajectory of finances. We all want the growth, but we're not prepared to talk about the political decisions. So, reflections on that, Mr. Hughes.
Yes, I would never begin to claim that the OBR was a perfect institution, or that perfection is possible in the world of forecasting. In the end, forecasting is about the future and it's uncertain. And so one of the things which we've always underscored in our work, and it was true in Robert's day, was really emphasising the uncertainty around forecasts and the risks around them through.
Do you think, just to really come to the point, do you think that we as politicians need to do a bit more to actually just face into the long-term challenges Britain faces?
Absolutely. I mean, as I said at the outset and on several occasions, just the lack of attention that the Risk and Sustainability Report gets, I think, is a serious shortcoming in the fiscal debate in the UK. The raw material is there to have it. And this committee has the ability to draw attention to these issues and has done in important ways with the work of the OBR in the past at highlighting risks, weaknesses, shortcomings that need to be addressed. The OBR jointly serves government and parliament and is duly accountable to both. And it is really important that where this committee thinks that there are issues or analysis that needs more attention drawn to it, that you bring that out and that you provide those kind of changes to the framework and your own mandates to the organisation to help fill them.
And is there any other? Dame Meg has mentioned, for instance, having a debate in Parliament or a statement on the long-term report. Are there any other architectural changes you'd suggest on the political side of the table in responding to OBR the OBR's longer term projections?
I guess the other thing which is missing is that there is remarkably little debate about the fiscal rules at the time that they're adopted. The Charter of Budget Responsibility, when it's adopted by Parliament, is one of the most important fiscal decisions any government takes. It tends to not be supported by that much analysis. It doesn't get a lot of attention and discussion in Parliament. But as you see, it's an incredibly binding and consequential choice that governments make, because they then try and live within those rules. And so I think having more context, more analysis, either from the Treasury or from the OBR or somebody, about what are the implications of the set of rules we're adopting, how much confidence do we have they're going to be met in the medium term, and how consistent are they in the long term, I think is important, that whenever those rules get introduced, that one kicks the tires as much as one can before you go snap on them, because once you do, we do want them to be around for quite a long time and actually shape decision making. Otherwise, they're just pointless.
And briefly, Sir Robert, is there anything you'd do change on the architecture, if you like, on the political side, the parliamentary side, on its interaction with the OBR, along the lines of what Mr. Hughes has mentioned there?
Not specifically on the interaction with the OBR. I think periodically it's worth looking at the whole, Richard's referred to this before, the whole structure and participativeness of the budget process, the points at which material is brought, the points at which, and the time that Parliament is able to devote to discussing these key issues, particularly, for example, around spending reviews, which are a very important part, discussion of what the role and size of the state should be over a medium-term period. I think the OECD's produced various reports. I remember one on the Irish budget system, and was talking about, the strengths of this were opportunity for stakeholders to participate, opportunity for Parliament to have detailed consideration, draft plans, etc. And I remember talking to one Treasury person who said, well, they think those are all the strengths of the Irish system. We think they're all the weaknesses. You just want a much more Treasury centralised process. At the end of the day, I think for Parliament to decide whether it feels that it has the appropriate amount of traction in the budget process in a context in which it is relatively Treasury-centric in this country and has been for many years, it's not necessarily the right answer, but probably one that should be thought about periodically.
And finally, Mr. Hughes, do you think that one of the messages, if you like, that you would give is that we need to be careful about blaming the OBR for what is a set of circumstances that arise from events and political decisions?
I think one thing I can say during my tenure, and I learned it from Robert, was that the OBR works very hard to very, very carefully stay within its mandate and colour within the lines set out in legislation and given to it by Parliament. But that mandate is very clear. The OBR's job is to forecast the public finances, say whether the government is on track to meet its fiscal rules, and highlight the risks around the forecast. But at no point during my tenure and at no point during Robert's tenure did we ever give policy advice to government. Did we ever express our own views on policy? Because we understand that what we're given is we're given a job as technocrats, and we're meant to inform the policy debate, but not be part of the policy debate. And we were always at pains to make sure that that was the case, and to not be drawn on questions around policy, even in committees like this, when we were invited to. So, I do think the OBR does its best job to inform the policy debate, and just because that debate doesn't end up in the place where people would quite like, in the end we're just messengers and people who are trying to make sure that debate is best informed.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And then just finally, just a very quick one from me, because I think you've sort of covered it obliquely, but we talked about resourcing a little bit along the way. Do you think there's enough staff? Are there any? Obviously, there's the IT system about what happened. We won't go over that again. IT modelling software. Are there any resources that the OBR should have in the modern world that it needs to have resources for? Well, I'll start with Richard Hughes because he was most recently there. So
in my experience, the OBR has grown now to about 54 people. I mean, the Treasury's got 200 economists and 2,000 people, so it's never going to be able to man-mark the Treasury as an organisation. But in my experience, whenever the OBR was given new responsibilities, it was given resources commensurate with the delivery of those responsibilities by the Treasury. It is unusual that the OBR relies on the Treasury for its budget. And I do think there's an important check on that in the form of this committee, which is that I think if at any point I felt as though, as chair, I wasn't being given the resources to deliver the tasks that I was given, or that the Treasury is trying to squeeze the organisation to make it harder to do the core job that it's got, my ability to come to this committee and say, look, we've got a problem, we want to provide you with information, but we haven't got the resources to do it. I think this committee is a really important source of oversight of the finances of the OBR and to make sure that it's resourced to do the job that it has. But for the moment, that's always happened. But I think it's partly because I've always known that I could have come here.
That's because it's interesting, because if you take, I suppose, not quite an equivalent, but the National Audit Office, which has 950-something people, but they have there is a special body called the Public Accounts Commission, made up of parliamentarians, or MPs, in fact, it's only the Commons, that determines the budget. It actually has that budget power, which the Treasury then has to cough up for. Do you think that there could be a benefit to having a further step to independence about how the Office for the Budget Responsibility budget is set?
I think there's definite benefit in this committee taking an interest in whether the OBR is sufficiently financed to provide you with the information that you want to hold the government to account. And I should say, to date, that has always been the case, but it may not be the case in the future.
I'm not sure. I mean, we'll have to go back through the annals of our committee's history over the last 15 years. I'm not sure there's ever been a need for the committee to ask the Treasury for more money, and so it's not being tested. So do you think, from what you're saying, you think that if there was a test, a mad, bad or dangerous government slashing the budget of the OBR, there is no power from this committee or anywhere else to reverse that?
Other than the power for my successor to raise it with you and you to draw attention to it. But formally, it's a decision made by the Treasury, and the OBR's budget is part of the Treasury's budget.
But basically, in summary, you don't think you're really short of resources, but there is no mechanism to absolutely guarantee that you get the resources if it was cut. Sir Robert?
I would agree. I think for my time, the OBR was adequately resourced to do the job that it was given. And I should say that, amongst other fiscal councils, the other 54 I spoke to, the two things that they would complain about most frequently were access to information and the adequacy of the budget to the job that they were given. So I think that has been a positive over time. I remember looking at the Public Accounts Commission model when people were talking about, what the status of the body should be, non-ministerial departments, etc. And I think that my feeling at the time was that the incentives for the Treasury and the OBR were sufficiently well aligned that most of the time, if the Treasury squeezed the resources going to the OBR, it would make their lives more difficult as well as the OBR's lives more difficult. Which
how's the impact?
I always felt, was one of the reasons why I never had to come to the committee to make those points. But I think one point on the role of this committee, in addition to funding, you are one of the three key lines of defence against political interference and inappropriate behaviour. You've got the officials at the Treasury who are obviously conflicted because they're serving ministers as well. You've got the Oversight Committee. You've got this committee as well. And it's absolutely key at a time when any institution goes through difficulty and there's the potential to use that as a pretext for moving things in an unsatisfactory direction. Your role's absolutely key at this time.
Okay, well, we always do prize our independence, but if there was a scenario with a mad, bad or dangerous government with a large majority, this committee would have a majority of that party on it. Well, I won't be tempted, Mr. Glenn. But this committee would have a majority on it. If there was a chancellor of that mad, bad, dangerous government who wanted to slash the funding, there could be an attempt, there could be a nasty alignment of interests against the OBR that you would be quite powerless to defend. So is there any need, do you think, for legislation or constitutional change to guard against that doomsday scenario? Well, we hope it's a doomsday scenario. Sir Robert, I'll go back to you and then...
I'm not sure what you could do that. I take your point, and interestingly, again, when we were set up and I explained the dual accountability, people would look at the Treasury Committee and say, but surely this is a government-dominated body. How on earth does that provide any assurance? And I did point out that's not in practice how the Treasury Committee has operated for many years, and that sense of independence is well found there. It would be an interesting question. I literally don't know the answer, that if... could the Public Accounts Commission literally stop any squeeze on the resources of the National Audit Office? There's a parallel. I now work in Northern Ireland where you have a set of institutions that are separately financed through the Assembly rather than through the process from the Department of Finance. That may be a potential, but I suspect that once you've got to a situation where things are as bad as that, the money may be only one of the problems you're confronting.
Indeed. So, Richard Hughes, just finally on that point.
This committee has a dual key over the appointment of the members of the BRC.
Yeah.
I think it would not be unusual for it to have a dual key, or at least some right of consultation on the resources that the OBR is given to make sure that it's got it's resourced adequately, because the incentives are asymmetric on government, and as Robert said, in some cases the way in which fiscal councils have basically been muzzled has not been by removing the personnel, but actually just by cutting the budget down to something which stops them from producing meaningful analysis. This has happened in European countries, so it's not science fiction.
Okay. Well, can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for their time. A privilege to have both the former chairs of the Office for Budget Responsibility, not quite in one place, but we nearly got there, Sir Robert, with you online. So thank you both for coming and for the work that you've done leading the Office for Budget Responsibility. This is just the beginning of our inquiry into this, and I should just say for the record that there's now an advert out for Mr. Hughes' successor as chair, and so that appointment will come to this. Whoever is recommended for that job will come here for a pre-commencement hearing from this committee. So can I thank our colleagues at both Ty and Hansard for their work. The transcript will be available on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days. Thank you very much. Order.
Thank you very much.